Greetings again, comrades, or should I say kukorads, for those of you who don't like camaraderie. On the chopping block today, I present a new idea for your consideration. I want to address a weak area in Stoicism as a living philosophy, and what I think could be a worthy reinforcement. Let's get into it. So what is Stoicism at its core? Stoicism is widely regarded by many who learn it, if not even maybe most who learn it, as a very pragmatic and very necessary approach to life. And at its core is something called the dichotomy of control, which essentially says that we suffer when we give power to things that are outside of our control, and we have peace when we direct our attention and focus only to those things which are inside of our control. When our contentment depends on external circumstances, we are at the mercy of external circumstances. When it depends only on ourselves, however, we are our own mercy. A simple example would be, imagine that you're looking forward to your Sunday morning walk in the woods. However, you wake up on Sunday to find that it's raining. The non-Stoic would likely sulk, retreat, have their morning ruined by not being able to go on their cherished Sunday morning walk, whereas the Stoic mindset, the Stoic person, would say, well, there is no bad weather, there's only bad attire. They put on their rain boots and put on their coat and go outside and have as good of a walk as they would have if it were sunny out. They decide how they are affected. Circumstances do not. And so that's what's really at the heart of all Stoicism, or of all Stoic philosophy. It's just the dichotomy of control, the notion that you will live a better life insofar as you are able to focus your attention on those things that are under your control and not be perturbed or thrown off course by those things that can affect you that are not within your control. And for those who don't know, Stoicism was practiced and taught by emperors like Marcus Aurelius, but also by former slaves such as Epictetus. Demonstrating this philosophy applies regardless of one's position in life. Though experience is a spectrum, suffering within it is inevitable in any position, as is our universal human desire to minimize it. In terms of minimizing it, there's an idea in Stoicism called premeditatio malorum, or meaning negative visualization. It advocates to think through misfortunes and obstacles before they occur, to reduce their power over us, and increase our ability to manage or accept them. So what if on that Sunday morning walk of yours, you encounter some variety of predator or threat? To live is not just to minimize suffering. It is to encounter threats, complexities, challenges. And not every solution is as simple as different attire or a passive acceptance of the circumstance. Some need different strategies. This is where Stoicism is often criticized as being a philosophy that advocates only for inward retreat, inward reframing, and without outward action or appropriate strategy in life. At the same time, Stoicism is very clear across different writers, different doctrines, that we ought to act upon what is within our control in line with reason. So then, what's right? Are we primarily to adapt to circumstance as it comes, focusing on how we react to it? Or do we also utilize whatsoever is in our power to mold circumstances to our favor? So this is what I would call the dichotomy of passivity in Stoicism, which is the weak point I described at the outset. So in this way, is it right, or is it in greater or lesser accordance with traditional Stoicism to be a passive Stoic or an active Stoic? What if more of what seems like circumstance can be molded by us than we initially presume? It's within this dichotomy that I see a new road at the intersection of Stoicism and game theory. That is, the active Stoic doesn't just accept the game they find themselves in. They actively try to mold its outcome while maintaining their inner strength and peace. In order to demonstrate what I mean, in the remainder of this video, we are going to break down some essential and digestible elements of what constitutes game theory, and thereby the beginning framework of an active Stoics game mindset. So we begin with games. What is a game? What do we mean when we say a game mindset or a game? Games are strategic situations where the outcome for you depends on the actions of things that are or seem to be outside of your control, such as other people, the world and its structures, both material and immaterial, even your own body and brain. Virtually everything we encounter is a game in a way. And a game is a situation that can be mapped into a framework for an optimal outcome. So the correspondence here to Stoicism should be relatively obvious, and that is that we awake to find ourselves in a world where virtually everything, even at times ourselves, is something that is out of our control. But that doesn't mean we are completely destitute, of course. Just as in Stoicism as in game theory, we have reason and can use it for generating frameworks for understanding obstacles and problems we face in order to navigate them most optimally or for the greatest outcome. Things as simple as what you choose to eat in a day, whether you choose to exercise, is even a game you play with yourself whose result is going to be your health later in life, or even currently. That health is something later in life that's going to seem outside of your control once it's gone awry, but which, in hindsight, different strategic choices could have led to a much different outcome. And that carries over to relationships, to job opportunities, to, any instance really you find yourself in could be interpreted as a game. So that brings us to having defined games. What is game theory? Game theory is the art and science of strategy, that is, of acting strategically within games, of generating optimal or favorable results through one's use of strategy. Strategy in this context is the generation of a framework for analyzing interactions when the outcome for a participant depends on the actions of others or other variables than yourself alone. So as we've set out then, game theory as applied to Stoicism is applying game theory to everyday interactions. While game theory is most often thought of as used in a tool in things like mathematics, business, and war, it can also be used as a tool to our advantage in thinking and acting strategically inside of our everyday lives. Whereas Stoicism traditionally focuses on how we govern only ourselves, a game theorist lens can extend that governance into the realm of interactions with others. So that is first to help one recognize what kind of game one is playing with others or with themselves, and what different outcomes are possible based on the moves that you could make. The Stoic game mindset is the mindset that doesn't just passively accept, but thinks and acts with tact. Think of a time that you acted in a way that you didn't fully think through, or that you acted irrationally in, and that later came to haunt you, or perhaps even haunts you still. The purpose of a Stoic game mindset is to never again say, "What have I done?" or "What have I said?" So that brings us to game awareness, which is seeing the strategic options around you, thereby avoiding the dangers of not knowing what games you're really playing. Once you're aware of the games you're playing, you can take the steps needed to change them to your strategic advantage. This is an exceptionally helpful concept. Applied to everyday circumstances, relative to our health example, let's go with, what do you choose at the grocery store? Are you making your choices in a way that is aware of or recognizing the potential future consequences of those choices? Or, in an argument with someone, are you arguing only from your side? Or can you map the interaction objectively and what the consequences may be or will be for approaching that conflict egotistically? Are you even aware of when you are being egotistical? In that interaction, are you able to discern what the other person is really after, or only what you yourself are after? Are you aware of how things could go differently if you were aware of both? Can you determine what would solve the issue with the greatest payoff to both of you? The point of game awareness is summarized well in the following quote: "The wise win before they fight, while the ignorant fight to win." That is the art of strategy. Which brings us to war games. War games are playing through your opponent's position and objectives, possible actions, and helping to reveal holes thereby in your own strategy. So this is a powerful concept, as we were just on the cusp of while discussing game awareness. So at its core is the ability to come out of yourself and be able to interpret yourself and the situation through someone else's eyes. It requires game awareness, as we described, but more than that, what your opponent wants and what they'll be willing to do in order to get it, and what impacts that may have on you. So the ability to actually think these things through before you yourself act gives you the ability to take whichever path you think will lead to the best possible outcome in the situation, rather than just acting on impulse and giving up any power you have in a given situation. So this brings us to incentives. Incentives are simply the rewards or penalties within a game that shape and motivate an agent's behavior. So essential to war games and game awareness is the ability to ascertain what the incentives and penalties are at play in any given game. And in any game, there are going to be incentives and penalties, and your ability to determine them will affect your ability to properly model a game in a war game. So that applies with yourself and the choices you make, but especially to your ability to read and navigate other people. If you can identify what is driving a person's choice or what that person fears in an interaction, you can more readily inform your own choice. And that brings us to payoffs, which are the outcomes of a choice measured in gains or losses relative to the chooser's objectives or the agent's objectives. So payoffs are similar to incentives, but not quite as straightforward. It's the ability to adjust based on perceived outcome, to compromise to get what you want, to take a small loss in order to achieve a greater gain. Put in the scope of Stoicism in some everyday interaction, imagine you're in a disagreement with someone and you know that you're right, but you know that the other person won't be able to handle that you're right. So you adjust your strategy. You don't point out that they're wrong or the way they're wrong. You choose to a greater good, which is, you scaffold your reaction to them in a way that they would find agreeable so as to avoid a larger conflict. That's an example of a payoff where you aren't as honest as you would be or you would like to be. But in that, taking that loss, the payoff of that loss is that, you maintain peace. So, in any given situation, are you aware enough to assess not only the incentives and penalties at play, but what payoffs are possible? Can you take a hit to secure a gain? That's something that's in your control. So this now brings us to information. So information is the ability and distribution of knowledge among agents in a game regarding the game, including others' actions, intentions, and possible outcomes. The information one has available to them is essential in decision making. So in the scope of daily life, are you really able, and to what extent are you really able, to determine the true incentives and payoffs for not only yourself, but for others? Are you in any given interaction or game aware of the degrees to which missing information may affect your decision making. Think of a time that you had a misunderstanding with someone. What is a misunderstanding? Generally, that arises from decisions made under incomplete information. So in a sense, relative to Stoicism, information is a very core piece of why we need to never let up, not allowing ourselves to be fully, attached to outcomes or external circumstances. Because in any given game of any kind, we most likely don't have all of the relevant information and will be vulnerable to the consequences of that missing information. This brings us to interdependence, a condition where the outcome of one agent's decision depends on the decisions of others. Whether a relationship grows or deteriorates depends on the actions of both players. The problem with passive Stoicism is that the human experience doesn't occur in a vacuum. We are social creatures our entire lives, and all of civilization is interdependent. You cannot close your eyes and say, I'm not affected. You are affected.
And you always will be.
That is why you must always be aware of the conditions, terms, circumstances within which you are playing. That is what it is, even within Stoicism itself, traditional Stoicism, to be aligned with reason. And that brings us to, we're getting close here, a rational player. What is a rational player? Which is an agent who consistently chooses the action that maximizes their expected payoff based on their preferences, beliefs, and available information. So, in other words, a rational player is a player who has a coherent view of the world, knows what they want out of it, and exercises a consistent pursuit of that self-interest. The mistake of passive Stoicism is to think your main self-interest is only in avoiding suffering at the hands of circumstance. To be Stoic is also to be aligned with reason and to concern yourself with, as we've said, what is within your control. And it is within your control to think, discern, and strategize. That is to be a rational player inside the game you find yourself. And that brings us to irrational player, which is an agent who does not consistently choose actions that maximize expected payoff, often due to bias, emotion, incomplete reasoning, or inconsistency in preferences. And isn't that what all of Stoicism tries to avoid? Traditional Stoicism in the doctrines tries to avoid one being. It's a player who sabotages their own interest by way of their own intellectual or emotional failures, which we are all very prone to if left to our own unreasonable devices. So in contrasting both players and their relevance to Stoicism, it's important in your everyday life to be able to actually identify which player are you. In the moment when you're acting, what kind of player are you acting as? Can you interrupt, your own behavior and thought process, be metacognitive, and act in line with your own interests? And in your interactions with others, are you able to identify what kind of player someone else is? And that distinction, or that ability to identify what kind of player you are so that you can change your strategy and your actions, is important, but also to be able to identify what someone else may want, what incentives, payoffs, from where is someone else acting based on what kind of player they are. So, within which category does someone else's behavior align with? This brings us to modeler's malaise, which is well summarized by a Mark Twain quote, which is, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so." Modeler's malaise is the concept that the process of modeling a game has a tendency to lull one into an uncritical acceptance of the assumptions implicit in that model, false confidence in the predictions and recommendations that it generates, and intellectual blindness to changing conditions. So that is to say that in all of your reasoning, all of your modeling, all of your thinking, a rational player must always assume some degree of skepticism and awareness that you likely do not possess all of the relevant information. And in a really interesting way, this is where Stoicism comes back to reinforce game theory. At the beginning and end of all strategizing, is the player doing so within the limits of what they know, what information they have, and what's in their control? And that leaves quite a lot of room for error, doesn't it? So friends, coming to our conclusion, what are we to do with all of this? How are we to tie all of these things together? In what way do all of these concepts come together to inform us as to how to be an active Stoic and overcome the problem of passivity and, live a strategic life with tact that results in optimal outcomes for ourselves and the people around us? I think the answer to that is well demonstrated within a concept called the knot of war, as described by Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the USSR during the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And he described the concept as, to the Kennedy administration as, in this conflict, in war, we've both got one end of this rope, and the tighter we pull, the knot in the middle becomes so tight that eventually the only way out is to cut it. So as I was listening to that, I couldn't help but think of the solution relative to an active Stoic in game theory is to think of that knot as tying your shoelace. Sometimes the case where you have something in a knot, you have a knot tied, but you can pull one string in such a way that the knot will release compared to pulling both. So I think that is the art of being an active Stoic with a game theoretic approach to life, is the art of tact, of being able to pull one side in such a way that it unravels in the way that we desire. So with that said, in our next one, we will look at some lessons from war and how the concepts and principles we've discussed today occur in those lessons and how those lessons in turn can be translated into everyday life. I will see you then.
I felt the pain of a brutal